We will now begin the lecture series that covers the tissue level of organization. This is the point in the semester where the material begins to become pretty intense. This is information that you may not have ever heard before. Up until now, if you've taken a chemistry or a biology course in high school or in college, you've heard about chemistry and cell biology. Tissue is really the new first topic in A&P 1. I'll remind you what a tissue is. A tissue is many cells or a group of cells working together to accomplish a task in the body. From then, once we know about tissues, we can better understand how an organ works, an organ being many tissues put together. So this material takes some time to get through. You're not going to be able to sit down and learn all the tissues of the body in one sitting. I recommend learning a few tissues every day. When it comes to tissues, I'm going to be reminding you over and over of what to focus in on. That is, be able to identify the tissue if given a picture, be able to understand the function of that tissue in the body, and then be able to give an example location of where you might find that tissue in the body. So we're going to first begin by covering the 4 basic tissue types. And then under each of these 4 basic tissue types, there are specific types of each. So first of all, by definition, a tissue is a group of cells. This group of cells function together to carry out specialized activities. So specialized activity means a function. There's a specific function for these cells. The 4 basic types include epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscular tissue, and nervous tissue. To better understand tissues, you got to first know the general idea of each of these 4. Epithelial tissue forms boundaries between environments. They form sheets of cells. A good example of an epithelial tissue is your epidermis of the skin. That epidermis of the skin is a boundary between the external environment and the internal environment. Epithelial tissue comes in a lot of different varieties, and we'll talk about this variation between epithelial tissue, but some epithelial tissue has to be more protective, like the epidermis has to be very protective. Some epithelial tissue is very thin, so it's not necessarily protective, but it allows substances to cross it very easily. Epithelial tissue is categorized based on how many layers of cells there are. So some epithelial tissue has many cell layers. Some epithelial tissue only has a single layer of cells. This drawing is an epithelial tissue with just a single layer. These cells are very tall, but there's only a single layer of cells that form this epithelial tissue. The next way we categorize is based on the shape of the cells. These cells, if you look closely, are column-shaped. So this would be a columnar epithelial tissue. So we'll get into those details once we dive in to the specifics of epithelial tissue. Connective tissue is the most variable, meaning there's a lot of different types of connective tissue. Some connective tissue is very protective and supportive, like bone. So bone tissue is a connective tissue. Some connective tissue is more liquid and transports molecules throughout the body, like blood. Blood is a liquid connective tissue. And then you got some that are kind of semi-solid, like cartilage. Cartilage is almost like a gel material. So there's a lot of variation in the connective tissues. And there's a lot of different functions of connective tissue. Muscle tissue or muscular tissue, I think we know what muscle does. It contracts, it shortens, and then relaxes and lengthens. And there's 3 types of muscle tissue we're going to talk about. There's skeletal muscle, which attaches to bones in order to move bones. There's cardiac muscle, that's in your heart to pump blood. And then there's smooth muscle, which is in organs that might have to move material, like your GI tract has smooth muscle in order to move food down the GI tract. Your respiratory tract has smooth muscle in order to dilate to allow more air flowing into your lungs. Your urinary tract has smooth muscle in order to help move urine from kidneys to the bladder and then out. So there's a lot of different organs that have smooth muscle. And then finally, there's nervous tissue. And I think we know nervous tissue must have something to do with your brain, your spinal cord, and then peripheral nerves. So these are the four basic categories. Now we have to dive into each of these four categories and learn the specific types of each. So we will begin with epithelial tissue. This is a general introduction to epithelial tissue. First, the general structure. Densely packed cells arranged in sheets. So these sheets can cover body surfaces like your epidermis. It might line the inside of hollow organs. So an example of a hollow organ would be your stomach. The inside lining of your stomach is made up of epithelial tissue. Another hollow organ could be your urinary bladder. The inside lining of your urinary bladder has epithelial tissue. It covers or lines the inside of cavities. If you think of your oral cavity or your mouth, it's lined with epithelial tissue. Other cavities in the body, like your pleural cavity that houses your lungs, or your pericardial cavity, those inside linings of those cavities are epithelial tissue. And then epithelial tissue is also used to make other structures like ducts, which are little tubes that might transport secretions. Like sweat glands have sweat ducts, and those little tubes, those little sweat ducts are made up of epithelial tissue. A couple important features of all epithelial tissue is that it's avascular. Avascular means without blood vessels. So there's no blood vessels in epithelial tissue. And most epithelial tissue can regenerate. That's because epithelial tissue often protects and it often gets damaged. And when you're damaging an epithelial tissue, it needs to repair and regenerate itself. Again, a good example would be your epidermis or your skin. We generate a new epidermis every few weeks. That epidermis is getting bombarded by chemicals and UV light and gets scratched and gets eroded by our environment. Well, we need to be able to regenerate that epidermis. Same thing for the inside lining of your GI tract. It always is regenerating itself. Function really depends on what tissue we're looking at, but it can protect, it can act as a selective barrier to allow certain things through, but not everything. And then it can be a surface that we secrete material onto. And we'll talk more about this as we get through each specific epithelial tissue. This shows a general drawing of an epithelial tissue made up of cells attached to some underlying connective tissue. Epithelial tissue has an apical surface, or a surface that is not attached to anything, and a basal surface, which is attached to a connective tissue using what's called a basement membrane. Basement membrane I like to think of as glue. It's what glues an epithelial tissue to a connective tissue. And there's a couple different layers to this basement membrane, but it's a membrane of material between the epithelium and the connective tissue. These drawings help you understand how we name a tissue, a specific epithelial tissue. The first set of names is based on how many layers there are. If there's a single layer of cells, we use the word simple. If there's many layers of cells packed on top of one another, we call that stratified. A strata is a layer. So if you're stratified, you have many layers. Then there's this one that's shown right here in between the two called pseudo-stratified. Pseudo means false. It means it looks stratified. If you look at this very quickly, it looks more like this one. But indeed, every single cell is attached to that basement membrane. So this is really a single layer of cells. It just happens to look stratified. So we use those words to describe the arrangement of the layers. Then we use these three words to describe the shape of the cells. If they are flat, it's a squamous tissue, or squamous, that means flat. If it's square or cube-shaped, we call that a cuboidal. If it's tall or columnar-shaped, we call that a columnar. So now we use each method to name a specific tissue. For example, this tissue is a simple squamous because it's a single layer of flat cells. This tissue is a simple cuboidal because it's a single layer of cube-shaped cells. This tissue looks like a stratified cuboidal. It's many layers of square cells. So we use a combination of these two characteristics to name a tissue. So in the next video, we're going to start to do that. We're going to start to look at specific types of epithelial tissue, why they are named what they are, a description of the tissue, where you might find that tissue, and then what would be the function of that tissue. And what I like to use is this table. So if you have your textbook, you can find these tables in your textbook. But the next video will begin our discussion on these specific types of epithelial tissue.